Have you had that moment at the grocery store checkout lately? You know, the one where you look at the receipt and just think, wait, how did that happen? If you have, you are definitely not alone. It feels like the price of everything is going through the roof, especially our food. So let's get into it and really unpack what is going on with our grocery bills. Okay, so if you're watching the news, you've probably heard one big reason over and over: the war in Ukraine. And listen, that is absolutely a huge piece of the puzzle. But the real question we're digging into here is it the only reason? Was the war the thing that started this whole fire? Or was it just the match that lit a fire that was already ready to burn? To really get a sense of the scale here, just look at this number. We're talking about a more than 100% increase in the price of basic staples, things like wheat, corn, and oats. And that's just since the pandemic started. That's not just a little price hike, right? That is a massive shock to the entire system. And it tells us this story began way before the current conflict. Right. So to understand how we got here, we have to rewind the clock a little bit. The truth is, the global food system was already showing some serious cracks. It was a system under a lot of strain, fragile, and pretty vulnerable. I love this quote from our source material because it just frames the whole situation so perfectly. Think about it like a fire. The war? Yeah, that's the match that started the blaze, no question. But the sirens, all the warming signs, they had been blaring for a while. So let's talk about what those sirens were. So first up, there's the environmental siren. For the past few years, our planet has been sending out some pretty clear distress signals. We've had these extreme heat waves across Europe and North America, scorching crops. At the very same time, you had severe droughts hitting these critical breadbasket regions in places like Iraq and even Canada. This was already tightening the global food supply before any conflict even began. And then, of course, COVID-19 hit. The pandemic was like someone took our global supply chains and just tied them in a giant tangled knot. You had lockdowns, labor shortages, and all kinds of shipping problems that made it way harder and a lot more expensive to get food from the farm to your dinner plate. The whole system just got less efficient, and costs were already on the rise. And this is so important to remember. Well before the world's attention was on Eastern Europe, lots of nations were already in a really bad spot. Countries like Afghanistan and Yemen were dealing with their own conflicts and instability. Entire regions across East Africa were battling these terrible droughts. The stage was basically already set for something to come along and turn all these regional problems into one massive global crisis. And that something, that match, was the war in Ukraine. This is the moment where all those pre-existing strains and pressures just exploded into the full-blown crisis that's creating ripple effects we're all feeling at the checkout counter today. This chart right here shows you exactly why this particular conflict has such an outsized impact on our food. Look at this. Russia and Ukraine, they aren't just minor players. They're absolute titans. Together, they account for a jaw-dropping 75% of the world's traded sunflower oil, almost a third of its wheat, and about 20% of its corn and barley. When you take a supplier that big out of the equation, everybody, everywhere feels it. But the impact goes even deeper than just grain, and this is a part of the story that a lot of people miss: fertilizer. It's not just about what Russia grows, it's also about what they supply. Russia provides about 40% of the natural gas that Europe uses to make its own nitrogen fertilizer. So when that gas supply gets choked off, fertilizer production just tanks. And that's how a gas dispute in Europe can directly cause a smaller rice harvest in Asia. It shows you just how connected and, frankly, how fragile this whole system is. And this just puts it all into perspective. Let that sink in for a second. Half of the food we eat, half of the entire world's population, is fed because we have modern mineral fertilizers. So when the things you need to make that fertilizer are disrupted, it's not a small problem. It's a direct threat to the very foundation of our global food supply. So on top of the environmental problems and the war, we have to add a whole other layer to the story: the economics of it all. Because how we responded with money and policy, well, it basically threw more fuel on the fire. For years, to keep the economy going, central banks were basically pumping more money into the system. That's a policy called quantitative easing. All that extra cash made it cheaper to borrow, but it also helped fuel inflation, pushing up the price of everything, including food. Now, they've slammed on the brakes, hard. They're pulling money out of the system, which is called quantitative tightening.
The goal is to get us all to spend less, what economists call demand destruction, to try and cool things off and bring prices down. It's a huge economic U-turn that's just adding another layer of volatility.
And as the crisis got worse, what do you think countries started to do? A lot of them panicked. We saw this wave of protectionism sweep the globe. Nations started slapping export bans on their own food, trying to protect their own people. Now, you can understand the impulse, but the effect was that it took even more food off the global market, which just squeezed supply even tighter and sent prices soaring for everyone else. So, with all that as a backdrop, where do we actually go from here? Well, the situation is incredibly complex, and the future is anything but certain. But I should say, it's not all doom and gloom. There are some real glimmers of hope out there. Wheat prices in the futures market have started to show signs of stabilizing. And amazingly, Ukrainian farmers have shown this incredible resilience, managing to plant a huge portion of their crops against all odds. People are also working hard to find new ways to get that grain out to the world. But the risks are still very, very real. The war is unpredictable, the markets are all over the place, and the huge wild card is what happens when China fully reopens from its lockdowns. How much will their demand surge? Nobody really knows. I think the big takeaway here is that we are not out of the woods, not by a long shot. This whole crisis has laid bare just how vulnerable the systems we all rely on really are, and it leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on. In a world where a conflict on one continent and a drought on another can directly affect the price of the food on your plate, is just looking out for ourselves enough, or is coming together to find global solutions the only real way to make sure we can all have dinner tomorrow?